I remember that night vividly, like a scar etched into my memory. The air in the cabin was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves conspired to press against me. I had come seeking solitude, a reprieve from the chaos of my life, but what I found instead was something far darker, something that defied reason and left me questioning the very fabric of reality. The villagers had warned me. Their words, spoken in hushed tones, carried an undercurrent of fear that I dismissed as mere superstition. They told tales of shadows that moved without light, of symbols carved into wood and stone that no one dared to touch. I thought myself above their fears. I wasn't from here. I was an outsider, a writer seeking the untamed beauty of the jungle to inspire my work. I believed in facts, in logic, in the tangible, but logic had no place in what I encountered. The cabin sat on the edge of the jungle, a weathered structure that seemed almost inviting in daylight. The sun painted the wooden beams in warm hues, and the rhythmic hum of nature surrounded me like a comforting blanket. But by night, it was a different world entirely. The shadows grew long and impenetrable, and the silence became a living thing, heavy and watchful. That particular night, the jungle was unnaturally quiet. No insects chirped, no distant calls of nocturnal creatures broke the stillness. It was as though the world itself held its breath. I woke abruptly, my heart pounding, the remnants of a dream slipping away like mist. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels alive, oppressive, and all-encompassing. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, its cold metal a small comfort against the growing unease. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the sparse interior. A table, a chair, a pile of books. Everything was as I had left it. Yet, something felt wrong, an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the atmosphere itself had turned against me. The faint metallic tang lingered, sharp and unnatural, like the aftermath of a storm. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the dead of night. But the feeling persisted, a gnawing sensation that something was watching. Then I heard it, a low hum, so faint at first I thought I imagined it, but it grew, resonating through the walls of the cabin, steady and deliberate, like a pulse in the earth. It wasn't a sound that belonged here. It felt alien, invasive, as though it reached into the core of my being. I swung my legs over the bed, the wooden floor cold against my feet. Each step toward the window felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself resisted my movements. The flashlight's beam quivered, a betrayal of my trembling hand. The window pane was fogged, the glass cold to the touch. When I wiped it clear, I saw nothing but the dense, impenetrable darkness of the jungle. Yet something had changed. There were scratches on the wooden frame, uneven and jagged, as though clawed by something desperate. My breath caught. I ran a finger over the marks, feeling the sharp splinters. They hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. I tried to rationalize, perhaps an animal, a bird, or a curious monkey. But the pattern, deliberate, almost intentional, sent a chill down my spine. Deep down, I knew this wasn't the work of any creature I could name. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the cabin and settling deep in my chest. I backed away from the window, the flashlight darting across the room. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, each corner a potential hiding place for something unseen. The flashlight's beam caught the edge of the chair, and I tripped, the loud crash shattering the oppressive silence. For a brief moment, the hum faltered as if startled, then returned with renewed intensity. Then came the scraping. Soft at first, like the tentative drag of nails on wood. It moved along the walls, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart thundered in my chest, my breaths shallow and ragged. Whatever it wasn't trying to break in. It was probing, testing, as though studying the boundaries of its prey. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, the metal slick with sweat. The scraping stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt deafening. I forced myself to move toward the door, each step a monumental effort against the weight of dread. Pressing my ear to the wooden surface, I listened. Nothing. But when I glanced down, I saw it. A faint symbol carved into the floorboards, intricate and alien, glowing with a sickly green light that cast shifting shadows across the walls. My stomach churned as I stared at the mark. It hadn't been there before. The lines were precise, geometric yet organic, like veins or roots intertwining in an unnatural symmetry. I didn't dare touch it, but its presence was undeniable. It was a message, or perhaps a warning, though its meaning eluded me. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner, my back pressed against the wall, the flashlight clutched like a lifeline. The hum faded with the first light of dawn, but the unease lingered, burrowing deep into my bones. When morning broke, the symbol remained, faint but still glowing, and the scratches on the window frame seemed deeper, more deliberate, as if taunting me. That morning, I ventured into the village, desperate for answers. The atmosphere was different. The villagers, usually warm if cautious, avoided my gaze, their movements hurried. When I mentioned the scratches and the symbol, their faces darkened. An elderly man muttered a single word before turning away. Marcado. Marked. The word clung to me, its weight growing heavier with each passing moment. I had come seeking inspiration, the beauty of the natural world, but instead I had found its shadow, something that didn't belong in the realm of science or reason, and it had left its mark on me. The village nestled at the jungle's edge was a world apart, suspended in a time untouched by progress. Dirt paths wove between wooden homes, their tin roofs rusted and bent from years of rain and sun. The air was thick with humidity and the faint, earthy scent of decaying foliage. Life moved to the rhythm of nature, dictated by the sun and the unspoken rules that govern survival. I arrived with little more than a duffel bag and a journal, seeking escape from the crumbling ruins of my life. The city I left behind had been a cacophony of mistakes, career missteps, failed relationships, and a creeping sense of emptiness. Here, I thought, amidst the jungle's raw beauty, I could rebuild something of myself, or at least forget what had been lost. The villagers greeted me cautiously. Their smiles, though polite, never reached their eyes. A wiry man with sharp features handed me a basket of mangoes, while a woman with weathered hands offered a clay jug of water. They spoke in soft tones, their language lilting and musical, but layered with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. Rosa, one of the few who spoke broken English, introduced herself and offered to show me around. Her voice carried a mix of warmth and warning. "You stay in the old hunter's cabin," she said, her gaze flicking toward the jungle. "Good place for quiet, for thinking. But don't go too far. The forest doesn't like strangers." I smiled, trying to put her at ease. "I'm here to study the wildlife, not disturb it. You don't have to worry about me wandering too far." She didn't return the smile. "It's not the animals you need to worry about," she said. "It's the spaces between them." Her words lingered as I followed her through the village, the dirt crunching beneath our feet. She pointed out the basics, a communal well, a small chapel, and the paths that led into the jungle. Children played nearby, their laughter subdued, their glances wary. The jungle loomed at the edge of every scene, its shadows stretching like silent sentinels. The cabin sat just beyond the village, a modest structure of weathered wood and creaking beams. By day, it seemed inviting, nestled amidst the vibrant greens of the jungle. But as Rosa handed me the key and turned to leave, the way her eyes darted to the tree line unsettled me. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time cataloguing the flora and fauna, marveling at the sheer vitality of the jungle. The air buzzed with life, from the iridescent wings of dragonflies to the distant calls of howler monkeys. But even as I immersed myself in the natural world, the villagers' unease weighed on me. They avoided certain paths and spoke in hushed tones whenever the jungle came up in conversation. Rosa's warnings echoed in my mind. "It's not just a story," she had said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a shadow of fear. "The jungle has its rules. It's older than anything we understand." I dismissed it as folklore, the kind of tales that grow in isolation and fear. But one morning, while walking along a trail, I found something that unsettled me. A tree trunk bore markings, faint but deliberate. Lines intersected at sharp angles, forming patterns too precise to be accidental. I traced them with my fingers, the bark rough beneath my touch. They felt wrong, as if they didn't belong to the jungle's organic chaos. When I asked Rosa about them, she hesitated. "We don't touch those," she said. "They're marks, signs." "Of what?" I pressed. "The forest speaks to those who listen," she replied, avoiding my gaze. "Sometimes it's better not to hear." Her answer only deepened my curiosity. I began venturing further into the jungle, driven by equal parts fascination and defiance. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to change. It grew cooler, heavier, the sunlight dimming beneath the dense canopy. The sounds of the village faded, replaced by a symphony of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Yet, amidst the vibrancy, there was an underlying silence, as though something waited just beyond my perception. One evening, I came across a clearing. In its center stood a smooth stone, its surface etched with markings similar to those I had seen on the tree. The patterns spiraled inward, converging on a central glyph that seemed to shimmer faintly in the fading light. As I approached, the air grew still, the jungle's hum falling away to a suffocating silence. The stone felt alive, its presence both magnetic and repellent. I knelt to examine it, but a sudden chill ran through me, a primal instinct warning me to leave. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of the stone. I sketched its markings in my journal, my pen scratching against the damp pages. The jungle, once a source of wonder, now felt like something else entirely, a living entity, ancient and unknowable, with secrets it guarded fiercely. That night, as I lay in bed, the unease settled deeper. The cabin creaked with the shifting of the wood, but it sounded different, deliberate. I listened intently, each groan of the beam sending a shiver down my spine. Outside, the jungle was eerily quiet. Even the usual chirping of insects had ceased. It was as though the forest itself held its breath. The next day, I sought out Felipe, the village elder. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp with the weight of experience. When I mentioned the markings and the stone, he stiffened. "You've seen the marks?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "What do they mean?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lit a pipe, the smoke curling around his weathered hands. "They're not meant for us," he said finally. "They're old. Older than the jungle, older than us. They're warnings, and you would do well to heed them." Warnings of what? His gaze shifted toward the jungle, of something that doesn't belong here, something that lives in the spaces we dare not tread. His words clung to me like a shadow. As I returned to the cabin, the jungle felt closer, its shadows darker, its silence more oppressive. The once comforting sounds of the natural world now felt like a thin veil over something far more sinister. The cabin, too, seemed to change. The walls, once sturdy, now felt fragile, as though they could barely hold back whatever lurked outside. That evening, Rosa came to see me. Her expression was grave, her usual warmth replaced by something colder. "You should leave," she said bluntly. I frowned. "Why? What's happening?" She hesitated, then said, "The jungle doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive." Her words left me unsettled, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something about the jungle called to me, even as it repelled me. It was a mystery I couldn't walk away from, even as the unease began to sink into my bones. Whatever the jungle held, I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The name Chupacabra surfaced first as a whisper, carried on the hesitant tones of Rosa one evening by the fire. Her voice was low, almost lost beneath the crackle of the flames, but her words bore the weight of centuries. She spoke of livestock drained of blood, their bodies eerily untouched. She described the stillness that settled over the jungle before it appeared, a silence so complete it felt as though the world itself recoiled from its presence. "It doesn't hunt for hunger," she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "It hunts for something else." "What does it hunt for?" I asked, leaning forward. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw fear that went beyond superstition. "It hunts fear. It feeds on it." Her words lingered, a chilling echo that followed me back to the cabin. The usual hum of the jungle felt muted, as if the forest itself conspired to conceal whatever moved within it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls seemed thinner, the shadows longer, and every creak of the wood sent a shiver down my spine. I clutched the flashlight tighter, its beam a feeble shield against the encroaching dark. The next morning, I sought out Felipe, the village elder. His home was a modest structure, adorned with faded symbols that seemed older than the village itself. He listened in silence as I recounted Rosa's story, his expression growing darker with each word. When I mentioned the markings I had seen on the stone, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said. "That place, it's not for us." "What do the markings mean?" I pressed. He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the jungle beyond his window. "They are doors," he said finally. "Marks left by something that doesn't belong here. Something older than this jungle, older than us." The Chupacabra? His eyes snapped back to mine, sharp and unyielding. It is not an animal, he said. It is not bound by the rules of this world. It moves through the spaces between. It chooses. And when it chooses, it does not stop. His words sent a chill through me. I had come seeking answers, but each revelation only deepened the mystery. As I left Felipe's home, the villagers' glances felt heavier, their silence more deliberate. It was as if my questions had stirred something best left undisturbed. Determined to understand, I ventured deeper into the jungle that afternoon. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, and the sounds of the village faded into an unsettling quiet. I followed a faint trail, its path winding through dense foliage and over gnarled roots. Hours passed, and just as doubt began to creep in, I stumbled upon another clearing. At its center stood a second stone, similar to the first but larger, its surface etched with even more intricate markings. The air around the stone felt charged, alive with an energy I couldn't explain. The markings seemed to shift under my gaze, their lines twisting into patterns that defied logic. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool surface, and a low hum vibrated through the clearing. It was the same sound I had heard in the cabin, but here it was stronger, more deliberate. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding as the hum faded, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. That evening, back at the cabin, I pored over my notes, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The symbols on the stone matched those on the floorboards, their intricate geometry hinting at a language or purpose I couldn't decipher. The hum lingered in my thoughts, its resonance echoing through my chest as though it had taken root within me. The villagers' stories became fragments of a puzzle I couldn't complete. Marta, a woman with eyes that seemed to pierce through me, spoke of glowing red eyes in the darkness and strange tracks that appeared overnight. Luis, the wiry hunter who had initially mocked my curiosity, grew somber when I mentioned the hum. "You're marked now," he said. "Once it notices you, it doesn't let go." "What does it want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "No one knows. Some say it feeds on fear. Others say it's looking for something or someone. But whatever it is, it's not something you can fight." His words offered no comfort, only a grim confirmation of my growing dread. That night, the hum returned, louder and more insistent, a vibration that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I sat on the edge of the bed, the flashlight clutched tightly, and listened to the sound of the jungle pressing in around me. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, felt like a prelude to something I wasn't ready to face. When dawn broke, I decided to confront the source of the hum. I retraced my steps to the second stone, the jungle's oppressive weight growing heavier with each passing moment. The clearing was just as I had left it, the stone's markings glowing faintly in the dim light. This time, I didn't hesitate. I placed both hands on the stone, its surface cold and smooth, and the hum surged through me, a wave of energy that left me gasping for breath. Visions flashed before my eyes. A dark, sprawling void filled with shifting shapes and glowing red eyes. The sensation was overwhelming, a torrent of fear and awe that left me trembling. When I pulled my hands away, the clearing felt darker, the jungle's silence more suffocating. I stumbled back to the cabin, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. That evening, I sought out Rosa again. She was reluctant to speak, her usual warmth replaced by a guarded unease. "The Chupacabra isn't just a story," she said finally. "It's not something you see. It's something you feel. And once it's chosen you, it's already too late." Her words haunted me as I returned to the cabin. The hum was waiting, louder than ever, its resonance filling every corner of the room. The symbol on the floor glowed brighter, its lines pulsating in rhythm with the vibrations. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the walls themselves had eyes. In the days that followed, the villagers grew more distant. Their glances were colder, their words fewer. Even Felipe, who had offered cryptic guidance, seemed to avoid me. The jungle, once vibrant and inviting, now felt alive in a different way, a sentient entity that watched and waited. Each night, the hum grew louder, its presence more invasive. The scratches on the window frames deepened, their patterns almost deliberate, as though left by something with intent. I tried to rationalize, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the evidence was undeniable. The marks, the hum, the villagers' fear, It all pointed to something real, something I couldn't escape. The Chupacabra wasn't just a legend, it was a force, a presence that defied understanding, and it had chosen me. The cabin was no longer a refuge. Its walls, which had once offered the illusion of safety, now felt fragile, like they could crumble under the weight of the oppressive force outside. The hum had become a constant companion, vibrating through the air and into my bones. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a reminder that I was being watched, hunted. That night, the jungle seemed closer than ever, its shadows pressing against the windows as if testing their strength. The scratches on the frames had deepened, jagged lines that seemed to form a pattern I couldn't decipher. I sat at the edge of the bed, the flashlight heavy in my hand, its beam flickering like a dying heartbeat. My breaths were shallow, each one a struggle against the suffocating air that filled the room. The first sign of its approach was the silence. The usual chorus of insects and nocturnal creatures fell away, leaving a void that felt unnatural. Then came the scratching, soft at first, like the hesitant touch of claws on wood. It circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, a predator's dance that sent chills down my spine. I clenched the flashlight tighter, its cold metal grounding me as my mind raced through 1,000 futile plans. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved from the walls to the door, the sound of nails dragging against the wood reverberating through the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a deafening drum that seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I approached the door. Pressing my ear against the wood, I listened, straining to hear anything beyond the relentless scratching. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound. I backed away from the door, the flashlight's beam darting erratically across the room. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching and twisting as if reaching for me. The hum surged, louder and more invasive, a vibration that rattled the very walls. My eyes darted to the symbol on the floor, its sickly green glow pulsating in rhythm with the hum. It seemed brighter now, more alive, its intricate lines shifting in ways that defied logic. A low growl broke the silence, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It carried a weight, an intelligence that sent a primal fear coursing through me. The growl came again, closer this time, and I realized with chilling clarity that it wasn't outside. It was inside. I swung the flashlight toward the corner of the room, the beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, and for a moment I thought I saw it. A shape, hunched and massive, with eyes that burned like embers in the gloom. It moved too quickly for me to focus, slipping back into the shadows as if it were a part of them. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightening as I tried to process what I'd seen. The growl came again, this time from the opposite corner. I spun around, the flashlight's beam trembling as it swept across the room. The shadows seemed to shift, alive with movement that I couldn't fully perceive. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that my breath formed visible clouds. The hum reached a fever pitch, its vibrations almost painful as they resonated through my body. And then the door burst open. The force of it sent a shockwave through the cabin, scattering papers and books across the floor. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my grasp as I fell to the ground. The beam wavered, casting erratic light across the room as the creature stepped through the doorway. It was massive, its hunched form dwarfing the cabin's interior. Its skin was dark, almost black, rippling like liquid shadow. Its eyes glowed a fierce, malevolent red, piercing through the gloom and locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The hum subsided, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped. The creature tilted its head, its movements unnervingly fluid, as if studying me. Then it took a step forward, its claws clicking against the wooden floor. I scrambled backward, my hands searching desperately for the flashlight. My fingers closed around its cold metal surface, and I raised it, shining the beam directly at the creature. It recoiled, a guttural snarl escaping its throat as it shielded its eyes. The light seemed to burn it, the edges of its form flickering like flames as it retreated slightly. But the reprieve was brief. The creature lunged, its movements impossibly fast, and I barely had time to roll out of the way. Its claws raked across the floor where I'd been moments before, leaving deep gouges in the wood. I scrambled to my feet, the flashlight's beam darting wildly as I tried to keep it in sight. It moved with an unnatural grace, slipping between the shadows as though it were a part of them. My mind raced, panic clouding my thoughts as I tried to think of a way to fight back. The symbol on the floor caught my eye, its glow pulsating with a frantic rhythm. I didn't understand its purpose, but it felt important, a tether to something larger than myself. Desperation drove me toward it, my feet slipping on the uneven floor as I ran. The creature snarled, its movements growing more erratic as I approached the symbol. I dropped to my knees, my hands hovering over its glowing lines. The hum surged, resonating through my chest and into my mind, filling every corner of my being. I didn't know what to do, but instinct guided my actions. My fingers traced the lines, the glow intensifying with each touch. The creature roared, a sound that shook the cabin and sent splinters flying from the walls. It lunged, its claws outstretched, but something stopped it. The glow from the symbol flared, a blinding light that filled the room and forced the creature back. It writhed, its form distorting as the light consumed it, its roars turning into anguished howls. And then, it was gone. The light faded, the hum subsiding into silence. I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The cabin was still, the air heavy with the aftermath of what had just occurred. The symbol on the floor dimmed, its glow fading until it was nothing more than an intricate pattern etched into the wood. I sat there for what felt like hours, the events replaying in my mind. The creature's eyes, its growls, the way it seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of reality, it all defied explanation. I had survived, but I knew this wasn't the end. The hum lingered at the edge of my perception, a reminder that the jungle's secrets were far from fully revealed. And somewhere out there, in the depths of the darkness, the Chupacabra waited. The morning after the confrontation, the cabin felt different. The air inside was heavy, the silence oppressive. The scratches on the walls and floorboards remained, their patterns more deliberate than before. The symbol that had glowed so fiercely the night before now lay dormant, its lines intricate but inert. Yet its presence lingered, an unspoken reminder of the creature's intrusion and the power it carried. I knew I couldn't stay passive. Whatever was happening, it wouldn't stop on its own. The Chupacabra wasn't just a myth, it was a force that had chosen me, marked me. If I wanted to survive, I needed answers. I began with the villagers. Their unease was palpable, their glances sharper and their words more clipped. Rosa, who had once been my guide, now avoided me entirely. Luis, the hunter, muttered curses under his breath when I approached. But Felipe, the elder, seemed to sense my desperation. He agreed to speak with me, though his tone carried a weariness that spoke of decades spent guarding secrets. "The jungle doesn't like outsiders," he said, his voice low. "But it's not the jungle you should fear. It's what lives in its shadows, in the spaces between what we can see." "The marks, the symbols," I pressed. "What are they? What do they mean?" Felipe's eyes darkened. "They are warnings left by those who came before us. Warnings to stay away from places where the veil is thin. The Chupacabra isn't an animal. It's something older, something that doesn't belong in our world. And you, with your questions, your trespasses, you have drawn its attention." His words sent a chill through me. I thought of the artifacts I had found, the stones etched with markings that seemed to pulse with life. Were they warnings, as Felipe said, or something more? I returned to the cabin and retrieved the notebook where I had sketched the symbols. The patterns were intricate, geometric yet organic, like veins or roots that spread outward with a deliberate rhythm. I spread the pages across the table, comparing the marks on the artifacts to the scratches on the walls. The similarities were undeniable. They weren't random. They were a language, a message I couldn't yet decipher. Determined to understand, I ventured back into the jungle. The path was darker this time, the canopy thicker, the air heavier. The clearing where I had found the second stone felt colder, the hum fainter but still present, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface of the earth. I knelt before the artifact, tracing its lines with my fingers. As I did, the hum grew stronger, vibrating through my chest and filling my mind with fragmented images, red eyes, twisted shapes, and a void that stretched infinitely. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the hum consume me, its resonance unlocking something deep within. The images became clearer, revealing scenes of rituals, of people gathered around stones like this one, their faces painted with fear and reverence. The Chupacabra was there, watching, its form shifting like smoke as it moved between them. They weren't just warning of its presence, they were summoning it. When the vision faded, I stumbled back, gasping for air. My mind raced with questions. The villagers spoke of fear, of avoidance, yet these rituals suggested something else entirely. Were their ancestors trying to control the creature? Or was it the other way around? Back at the cabin, I sought solace in Father Mateo, the village priest. He was reluctant to speak, his gaze heavy with worry as he listened to my account. But when I mentioned the artifacts, his demeanor shifted. He retrieved a weathered book from a locked cabinet, its pages yellowed with age and filled with handwritten notes and sketches. "This is all we have left," he said, laying the book before me. Records of the tethered ones. They are beings that exist between worlds, drawn to places where the boundaries are weakest. The Chupacabra is one of them, not a creature, but a force. It doesn't kill for sustenance, it kills to anchor itself, to maintain its presence in our world. The book's pages were filled with sketches of symbols similar to those on the stones, along with notes written in a language I couldn't decipher. Father Mateo pointed to a particular illustration, a creature with elongated limbs, glowing eyes, and a hunched posture. Around it, the symbols radiated outward, forming a complex web. The stones, he said, are keys. They can open the veil or close it, but their power is not ours to wield. That power belongs to the tethered ones. His words filled me with a mixture of dread and determination. If the stones were keys, then understanding their purpose might be the only way to break the creature's hold. But as I delved deeper into the book, its cryptic notes offered more questions than answers. The tethered ones thrived on obsession, on fear. The more you thought about them, the stronger their grip became. Over the next few days, I pieced together what I could. The Chupacabra was more than a predator. It was a parasite, feeding on the fear and despair of those it marked. The marks weren't just warnings, they were claims, signs that the creature had chosen its prey. The artifacts, with their pulsating hum and shifting symbols, were its tools, left behind to draw in the curious and the desperate. I reached out to Dr. Alvaro Vega, a cryptozoologist whose name I had encountered during my earlier research. His voice, when he answered, carried a mix of excitement and caution. "You've seen it," he said. "The Chupacabra isn't just a legend, it's a window into something far older than humanity. But if you've been marked, you're in grave danger." Dr. Vega explained that the Chupacabra existed on the fringes of reality, slipping through cracks in the fabric of the world. The artifacts were anchors, allowing it to maintain its presence. But they're also its weakness, he added. If you can decipher the symbols, you might be able to sever its connection. His words offered a glimmer of hope, but also a heavy burden. The hum, the symbols, the visions, they were all pieces of a puzzle I was barely beginning to understand. And the more I delved into it, the closer the creature seemed to come. That night, the hum returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The cabin's walls seemed to pulse with its rhythm, the symbol on the floor glowing faintly in response. I sat at the table, the artifact before me, its surface cold and smooth. My fingers traced its lines, the hum vibrating through my skin as the symbols began to shift and rearrange. They formed a new pattern, one that resonated with a clarity I couldn't explain. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. The artifacts weren't just tools for the Chupacabra, they were also its prison. The symbols, when aligned correctly, could trap it, forcing it back into the void from which it came. But the process was dangerous. The creature would fight, and its desperation would make it more powerful than ever. I prepared myself as best I could, my hands trembling as I sketched the new pattern into my notebook. The jungle's hum seemed to grow louder, the shadows outside the cabin pressing closer. I didn't know if I would survive the night, but I knew I had no choice. The Chupacabra was coming, and this time I would be ready. By the time the next night fell, the weight of the jungle had grown unbearable. Every sound, every distant rustle or snapping twig carried with it the promise of something unseen, something watching. The hum that had once been a faint, ominous rhythm now roared in my ears, relentless and invasive. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was inside me, threading through my thoughts, twisting them into shapes I barely recognized. The cabin was no longer a place of refuge. Its walls, marked with scratches and symbols, felt like they were closing in. The glow of the markings on the floor returned, stronger now, pulsating like a heartbeat. Each pulse sent a wave of nausea through me, as though my body was rebelling against the unnatural energy that filled the space. I tried to distract myself, to focus on the patterns I had traced in my notebook, but my hands trembled too much to hold the pen steady. The symbols blurred before my eyes, shifting and rearranging themselves even when I looked away. My own thoughts betrayed me, filling my mind with visions of red eyes, of claws tearing through the thin walls, of the hum consuming everything until there was nothing left. The first knock came just after midnight. It was soft, almost polite, a single tap against the cabin door. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I stared at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound that set my teeth on edge. I clutched the flashlight, its beam flickering as though it too felt the presence outside. The scraping moved along the walls, slow and deliberate, tracing a path that circled the cabin. I backed into the corner, my breath shallow and rapid. The hum grew louder, a vibrating pressure that seemed to press against my skull. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as they grew louder, they became words, spoken in a language I couldn't understand. The cadence was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, drawing me toward the glowing symbol on the floor. My legs moved without my consent, carrying me closer until I stood over it, the green light casting eerie shadows across my face. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. And then the door shook. A single massive blow rattled the frame, sending splinters flying. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling across the floor. The door held, but the pounding continued, each strike more forceful than the last. The hum swelled, the symbol's glow intensifying until it filled the entire cabin with its sickly light. I dropped to my knees, my hands covering my ears as the sound became unbearable. My vision blurred, the edges of the room distorting as though the walls were bending inward. The markings on the floor shifted, their lines twisting and spiraling into new, incomprehensible patterns. The pounding stopped, and for a brief, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then I saw it. The shadows in the corner of the room twisted and coalesced, forming a shape that defied logic. It moved like liquid, its edges shifting and breaking apart before reforming. Its eyes glowed, 2 points of crimson light that pierced through the haze of the cabin. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the oppressive light. My body refused to move, frozen in the grip of a fear so profound it felt like drowning. The creature stepped forward, its form solidifying with each movement. Its limbs were elongated, its claws sharp and glinting in the green glow. It stopped just short of the symbol, its head tilting as it studied me. The hum faltered, replaced by a low guttural growl that vibrated through the floor and into my chest. I forced myself to move, scrambling backward until my back hit the wall. My eyes darted to the artifact on the table, its surface dull and lifeless. Desperation clawed at me as I lunged for it, my fingers closing around its cold surface. The creature snarled, its form rippling like water as it lunged forward, stopping just short of the glowing markings on the floor. The artifact pulsed in my hand, a faint vibration that mirrored the hum. I held it up, the symbols on its surface flickering to life. The creature recoiled, its snarl turning into a hiss as the light from the artifact grew brighter. I didn't understand what I was doing, but instinct drove me forward. I stepped closer to the symbol, the artifact's light intensifying with each step. The creature backed away, its movements erratic and frantic. It lashed out, its claws raking across the walls, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The hum reached a crescendo, the symbol on the floor blazing with light that burned my skin. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my mind with incomprehensible words and images. The creature let out a final ear-splitting roar before it dissolved into the shadows, its form scattering like smoke. The light dimmed. the hum fading into silence. I collapsed to the floor, the artifact slipping from my grasp. My body trembled, every muscle aching from the strain. The cabin was still, the air heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation. The symbol on the floor was dark once more, its lines faint and dormant. But I knew this wasn't over. The whispers lingered at the edges of my mind, a constant reminder that the Chupacabra wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, biding its time. And the fear that had taken root within me, that had fed it, wasn't something I could simply erase. The villagers didn't speak to me the next day. Their glances were sharp, their movements hurried. Even Felipe avoided me, his silence heavy with unspoken warnings. I was an outsider now, not just to them, but to the world I had known. The jungle's secrets had marked me, and there was no going back. That night, the cabin was quieter than it had ever been. The hum was absent, the symbol inert, but the fear remained, coiled in my chest like a living thing. I sat in the corner, the artifact in my hands, and waited for the shadows to move again. The night of the final confrontation began with an unnatural stillness. The jungle, which had always been alive with sound, fell silent as though bracing itself for what was to come. The air was heavier than ever, pressing against my chest, making each breath a deliberate effort. The hum that had haunted me for days returned, louder and more insistent, vibrating through the cabin like a warning bell. I stood at the center of the room, the artifact clutched tightly in my hands. Its surface, once cold and lifeless, now radiated a faint warmth. The symbols etched into it flickered, their light pulsing in time with the hum. The symbol on the floor glowed faintly, its lines shifting and reforming into patterns I couldn't comprehend. I knew this was it. The Chupacabra wasn't coming for me. It was already here. The first blow came without warning. The door buckled under a force that sent splinters flying across the room. I staggered back, the artifact trembling in my grip as the hum grew deafening. The door held for a moment longer before collapsing inward, revealing the creature standing in the doorway. Its form was massive, a shadow made flesh, its edges rippling like smoke. Its eyes burned with a fiery red light, locking onto me with an intensity that froze me in place. The creature stepped inside, its claws clicking against the wooden floor. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the fear that radiated from me. The hum subsided, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all sound. My mind raced, the weight of the artifact grounding me even as panic threatened to consume me. I raised the artifact, its symbols flaring to life in response to the creature's presence. The light seemed to repel it, forcing it to hesitate. But the hesitation was brief. It lunged, its movements impossibly fast, and I barely managed to dive out of the way. Its claws raked across the wall, leaving deep gouges that oozed a dark, unnatural substance. I scrambled to my feet, the artifact's glow illuminating the room in a sickly light. The creature turned, its movements unnervingly fluid as it circled me. It didn't attack again immediately. Instead, it seemed to study me, its head tilting as though trying to understand the artifact's power. The silence was broken by a low growl, a sound that resonated deep within my chest, filling me with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. "You can't have me," I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. The words felt hollow, but saying them gave me a shred of control. The creature's growl deepened, its form rippling as though in response to my defiance. It lunged again, faster this time, and I barely managed to bring the artifact between us. The light from the symbols flared, striking the creature and forcing it back. It howled, a sound that shook the very walls of the cabin, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began to shift, its form elongating and twisting into something even less human, less defined. The artifact pulsed in my hands, its light growing brighter as the symbols shifted and rearranged themselves. I felt a connection, a thread of understanding that bound me to it. This was more than a tool. It was a weapon, a key, and a conduit for something far older and more powerful than myself. The realization filled me with both awe and dread. The creature's attacks grew more erratic, each lunge more desperate than the last. It seemed to sense the artifact's power, its movements frantic as though trying to extinguish the light. I stood my ground, the artifact's glow shielding me even as the creature's claws came dangerously close. The symbol on the floor flared brighter, its patterns shifting faster, aligning with the artifact in a way that felt deliberate. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the cabin with a cacophony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The words seemed to come from the artifact, from the symbol, and from the creature itself. They wove together, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. I felt myself being drawn into it, my thoughts merging with the rhythm of the whispers. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting roar and lunged once more. This time, I didn't step back. I raised the artifact high, its light blazing as the symbols reached their final alignment. The glow filled the room, consuming everything in its path. The creature stopped mid-lunge, its form convulsing as the light engulfed it. It howled in agony, its body breaking apart into tendrils of shadow that writhed and twisted before dissipating into the air. The light from the artifact dimmed, its warmth fading as the symbols returned to their dormant state. The cabin was silent once more, the oppressive hum gone. I collapsed to the floor, the artifact slipping from my grasp as exhaustion overtook me. My body ached, every muscle trembling from the strain. But I was alive. The Chupacabra was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The symbol on the floor was dark again, its lines faint and still. The scratches on the walls remained, silent testimony to the creature's presence. But the air felt lighter. The weight that had pressed against me for days finally lifted. When I finally stood, the artifact lay cold and inert on the floor. I picked it up, its surface smooth and unremarkable. It felt heavier now, not in weight, but in significance. I didn't know if I had defeated the Chupacabra or merely driven it back to the void from which it came. But for now, it was gone, and that was enough. The villagers greeted me with a mixture of relief and caution when I returned. Their fear had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. Rosa approached me, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and trepidation. "It's over," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The artifact remained in my bag, a constant reminder of what I had faced. The jungle's shadows seemed less menacing now, but I knew better than to trust appearances. The Chupacabra wasn't just a creature. It was a force, an echo of something far older and more powerful than any of us could understand. And I had survived it. The days following the confrontation passed in a blur. The villagers were kind, but their kindness was tinged with unease. They offered me food, helped patch up the cabin, and avoided meeting my eyes. It was as though they feared acknowledging what had happened, as if speaking of it might call the darkness back. Rosa tried to reassure me, her words gentle but hollow. "The jungle forgets," she said. "In time, you will too." But I knew that wasn't true. The jungle didn't forget, and neither would I. The scars it left weren't just on the walls of the cabin, but etched deep within me. At night, I still felt the hum, faint but persistent, like a phantom vibration in the corners of my mind. The artifact lay wrapped in cloth at the bottom of my bag, its surface cold and lifeless. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, let alone touch it. It was both my salvation and a constant reminder of how close I had come to being consumed. I spent hours staring at the notebook where I had sketched the symbols, trying to make sense of them. Their intricate patterns no longer shifted, but their meaning remained elusive. Were they a language, a warning, a promise? The questions gnawed at me, filling the silence of the cabin with an oppressive weight. Fear lingered, not the sharp terror of the creature's presence, but a dull, unshakable anxiety. It clung to me like a shadow, turning every rustle of leaves and every creak of wood into a potential threat. I tried to return to my work, cataloguing the flora and fauna of the jungle, but it felt hollow. The beauty that had once captivated me now seemed alien, as though the jungle had revealed its true face, and I could never again see it as I had before. The vibrant greens, the symphony of life, all of it felt like a thin veneer over something far darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that the jungle was watching, that it knew what I had seen and what I had done. Felipe visited me once, his expression solemn. He didn't ask about the creature or the artifact. Instead, he spoke of the jungle, of its ancient power and the delicate balance that sustained it. "You've seen what lies beneath," he said. "Most don't survive that. But surviving isn't the same as escaping. The jungle, it marks those it chooses. You carry it with you now. His words stayed with me long after he left. I had thought the artifact was the mark, a physical sign of the creature's influence. But Felipe's tone suggested something deeper, something I couldn't see or understand. The villagers' wariness made sense now. I wasn't just an outsider. I was something else entirely. A person who had touched the edge of a world they feared and revered. I decided to leave. Staying felt like tempting fate, as though the jungle might change its mind and reclaim me after all. The morning I packed my bag, Rosa came to the cabin. She didn't try to stop me. Instead, she handed me a small charm made of bone and feathers, its surface etched with symbols that mirrored those in my notebook. For protection, she said simply. Her eyes held a sadness I couldn't place, a quiet acknowledgement that the charm was more for her peace of mind than mine. The journey back to civilization was uneventful, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The jungle's shadows seemed darker, its silence more pronounced. Even as I reached the edge of the trees and stepped onto the dirt road that would lead me to the village's outskirts, I felt its presence, a lingering awareness that stayed with me long after the canopy gave way to open sky. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild a semblance of normalcy. I returned to my apartment, unpacked my belongings, and resumed the routines of daily life. But the jungle had changed me. The hum was gone, replaced by a silence that felt equally oppressive. At night, I dreamed of red eyes and shifting shadows, of whispers that spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. I avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces. Once, while washing my hands, I thought I saw the faint outline of the symbol etched into my skin, glowing softly beneath the surface. It was gone when I looked again, but the image stayed with me, a constant reminder that the jungle's mark wasn't something that could be erased. I sent the artifact to Dr. Alvaro Vega along with my notes and sketches. He called me a week later, his voice a mix of excitement and trepidation. "This is incredible," he said. "The symbols, the artifact, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. But there's a weight to it, a presence. Are you sure you want me to keep it?" I told him yes, that I couldn't bear to have it near me any longer. But even as I said the words, I felt a pang of regret. The artifact had saved me after all. It had been my lifeline in the face of something incomprehensible. Yet, I knew it was more than that. It was a tether, a link to the creature and the world it came from. Keeping it felt like inviting that world to reclaim me. Weeks turned into months, and the memories began to blur, though they never faded entirely. The jungle's hum still lingered at the edges of my awareness, a faint vibration that surfaced when I was alone or in the dark. I avoided the news, fearing I might hear stories of livestock drained of blood, of strange markings on trees, of shadows that moved where no shadows should be. Part of me wanted to know, to confirm that the creature hadn't followed me, but a larger part was too afraid to look. In the end, I accepted that survival came at a cost. The jungle had shown me its truth, and that truth had marked me in ways I couldn't fully understand. Fear, I realized, wasn't something you could escape. It was something you carried, something that shaped you. And perhaps in some ways it was a reminder that I was still alive. The artifact, the creature, the jungle, they were all part of a story that would never truly end. And though I had left that place, its shadows would always be with me, lingering in the corners of my mind, whispering their secrets to anyone willing to listen. I wish I could say the story ends here, that leaving the jungle meant leaving the darkness behind. But the truth is, the Chupacabra, or whatever it truly is, never really left me. It lingers, not in the corners of my home, but in the recesses of my mind, an ever-present shadow I can't quite shake. I tell myself it's over, that the artifact is safely out of my hands, that the jungle's secrets are buried where they belong. But some nights, when the world is quiet and the darkness feels too deep, I hear it again. The faint hum. It's almost imperceptible, a vibration just below the edge of hearing, but it's there. It's always there. The dreams are harder to dismiss. They come less frequently now, but when they do, they feel more real than anything I've experienced since leaving the jungle. In them, I'm back in that cabin, the symbol on the floor glowing brighter and brighter as the walls close in around me. The whispers return, louder and more coherent, speaking words I still can't understand but somehow feel are meant for me. And always in the distance, I see those eyes, red, piercing, watching. Sometimes I wake up and swear I've seen the symbol etched faintly into the wall beside my bed or glowing softly in the reflection of a window. It's always gone when I look again, but the unease it leaves behind is impossible to shake. I've stopped trying to convince myself it's my imagination. The jungle doesn't let go of its chosen so easily. I've thought about reaching out to Dr. Vega to ask if he's experienced anything since taking the artifact. But I can't bring myself to make the call. Part of me doesn't want to know. Ignorance, I've found, can be its own kind of protection. The less I know, the less I have to confront the possibility that it's not over. And maybe that's the truth I've been running from. It's not over. It might never be over. The Chupacabra wasn't just a creature. It was a force, a manifestation of something far older and more profound than anything I can comprehend. It didn't belong in our world, but it had found a way in, and for a time, it had chosen me. That kind of mark doesn't fade, it becomes part of you. Now, I'm careful. I avoid the woods, keep my windows locked, and surround myself with light. But there are moments, fleeting but undeniable, when I feel it. A presence, a shift in the air, a shadow that moves when it shouldn't. It's never enough to prove anything, never enough to call it real, but it's enough to remind me that it's still out there. And that's the thing about fear. It's not something you defeat. It's something you live with, something that shapes you, that teaches you to survive. The Chupacabra taught me that. It showed me the limits of what I thought I could endure, and then pushed me beyond them. It left me broken, yes, but also alive. And as long as I'm alive, I'll carry its shadow with me. So I tell myself it's over, even though I know better. Because the alternative is to wait, to wonder, to fear the day when the hum grows louder again, when the whispers return, when the red eyes reappear in the darkness. And maybe they will. Maybe it's only a matter of time. But for now, the jungle is quiet, and the shadows are still. And I'll take that. I'll take the silence, even if it's only temporary. Because in the end, survival isn't about defeating the darkness. It's about learning to live with it, to carry it, and to keep moving forward, even when it feels like it's all around you. And if the Chupacabra does come back, I'll be ready.